Why being misunderstood is the final stage of becoming yourself. Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that the deepest loneliness a person can suffer has nothing to do with how many people surround them, and everything to do with what cannot be said, even to the ones who love them most. Here is the premise, and I want you to sit with it before we go further. Jung wrote in his memoirs, in a passage he placed near the very end of his long life, looking back on all of it, that loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. That line is from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, page 356. And I want you to notice what he did not say. He did not say, loneliness comes from being alone. He did not say it comes from rejection. He said it comes from a gap between what is real inside you and what language can carry across to another person. And if you have ever sat at a table full of people who like you, people who would call themselves close to you, and felt a strange, hollow distance open up right in the middle of the conversation, you already know exactly what he meant. You were not abandoned in that moment. You were simply carrying something that the room had no shape for. And that, Jung would say, is not a failure of your relationships. It is the leading edge of your own becoming. So let me bring this home before we start, because there is a version of you who has quietly decided that being understood is the proof that a life is going well, and being misunderstood is the proof that something has gone wrong, and I want to offer you a different frame tonight. One where the growing distance between your inner world and the words you have for it is not a sign of failure, but a sign of depth. So here is my first reflection. I notice the places where I have gone quiet, rather than try to explain myself again. Here is my second. I recognize that quiet is evidence of a self that has outgrown its old vocabulary. And here is my third. I choose to stop treating that gap as shame and start treating it as information. Say it with me. I make the unconscious conscious. And again, I make the unconscious conscious. And if this is landing somewhere in you tonight, consider staying close to this channel so tomorrow's teaching finds you too. There is no cost to that, only continuity. Now, before the keys, I want to ask something small of you. If there is a place in you right now that just went quiet, recognizing something it has never had a name for, type the two words "face it" in the comments, not as a performance, just as a private marker, a seal on what you already know is true. The first key is that misunderstanding is not a wound, it is a signal, and I want that distinction to do its work, because most of us were raised to treat being misunderstood as an emergency, something to fix, through more explaining, more effort, more words thrown at the gap, until somebody finally gets it. But Jung's psychology rests on a quieter premise, that the psyche develops, that the person you are at 20 is not the person you are at 50, and that this movement is intensely individual, which means the further you travel into your own real experience, the further you travel from the shared vocabulary that got you through the first half of your life. Imagine a woman who spent decades explaining her choices in terms everyone could recognize: family duty, career logic, the reasonable narrative. And then one day, she starts deciding from somewhere she cannot fully name even to herself, and her friends look at her with polite confusion. Not hostility, just a gap. That gap is not proof she has gone wrong. It is proof she has moved. The signal is doing exactly what it should, telling her that her inner situation has changed faster than her outer explanations have caught up, and the temptation is always to panic and shrink back down to what is easily understood. But the more honest response is to notice the gap the way you would notice a fever, not as an insult, but as information about something happening beneath the surface. And this same signal shows up in far smaller moments. Think of the last time someone asked, "How are you?" and you felt a small flinch before answering. A half second where the true answer and the easy answer separated. That flinch is the same mechanism compressed into a single breath. Most days you reach for the easy answer, fine, nothing much, and the moment passes unnoticed. But pay attention to how often that flinch occurs in a single week, and you will see the outline of a self quietly outpacing its own explanations. And here is the reframe to carry with you. A fever does not mean the body has failed. It means the body is working beneath the surface. And the flinch, the gap, the moment of feeling unreachable even by people who love you, functions the same way. So the next time that gap opens, resist slamming it shut with a quick borrowed phrase. Let it sit open one breath longer and simply notice what it is trying to tell you. I do not perform my understandability. I let it be a signal, not a verdict. The second key is that the persona was built for exactly one purpose, to be understood quickly, and that purpose starts to conflict with individuation the moment individuation truly begins. Jung described the persona as that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. It is the negotiated mask, the professional face, the family role, and here is the uncomfortable part. The persona works precisely because it is made of shared, recognizable material. The responsible one, the funny one, the reliable one. Shared symbols are understandable by definition. That is their whole function. But individuation is not a process of perfecting your persona. It is a process of discovering what lies underneath it. And what lies underneath was never built out of shared material. It is idiosyncratic, textured by your particular history and your particular loves. And idiosyncratic material resists quick translation by its very nature. So as more of the true material beneath the mask surfaces, you are trading fluency for authenticity. The words get harder to find, not because you are failing at communication, but because you have moved into territory the common vocabulary never mapped. Notice how this feels from the inside. You are asked a question that used to have an easy answer. How is work? How is the marriage? And you open your mouth to give the old fluent answer and find a half-second of friction before it comes out. Most people push through that friction and say the old sentence anyway, because it is available, and the truer thing is not yet built. Imagine a man known for 30 years simply as dependable, praised for it at every family gathering, and in his 50s he feels pulled toward something quieter, harder to name, and when he tries to put words to it with his oldest friends, he watches their faces go a little blank, not from indifference, but because dependable had a shared shape, and this new thing does not yet have one. So sometimes, to spare everyone the discomfort, he puts the old mask back on because it still fits well enough to get through dinner, and something in him quietly notes the cost. This happens in small exchanges too. A friend asks why you seem different lately, and the real answer is, I am becoming someone I do not have language for yet. But that sounds strange out loud, so you hand over the tidy persona answer instead. And the gap between what was true and what was said closes over quietly, unnoticed by anyone but you. None of it is rejection, it is simply the cost of having outgrown the shared shape faster than a new one has formed. I do not confuse the mask with the self, and I do not mistake its fluency for truth. The third key is older than any of us, and it comes from Jung's own childhood, long before he had any theory to explain it. He recalled, in the opening pages of his memoirs, a secret he kept as a boy, a small mannequin he carved and hid inside a pencil case, tucked beneath a floorboard in the attic, along with a smooth, blackish stone he had painted, and he would go up there alone to visit this hidden thing, and he wrote that no one else knew about it, and that the secret possession of it had a profound influence on his character. His first attempt at giving shape to something in himself that had no other outlet. Notice what he did not do. He did not run to his parents and try to explain the mannequin. He did not need them to understand it for it to be real. The entire value of the thing lay in its privacy, in the fact that it lived in a layer of his life language had not yet touched. And this is strange and important, because we assume an experience only becomes real once someone else nods and says yes. I see it too. Yet Jung's first psychological act as a child was to build something private, wordless, entirely his own. And let it be enough that he alone knew it was there. This is the seed of everything he later called individuation, the recognition that psychic reality has rooms never meant to be furnished for visitors, and that some of what is most real in you will simply never fully cross the bridge into another person's understanding, and that this is not a defect. It is the shape of an inner life at all. The boy did not need his parents to approve of the mannequin or even to know it existed, because a container does not stop holding water simply because no one has looked inside it. Consider how this pattern shows up in lives that look nothing like a Swiss boy's attic. Imagine a man who keeps a single photograph in his wallet he has never explained to anyone, not because he is hiding shame, but because the meaning lives in a register conversation was never built to carry. Or a woman who returns every autumn to a stretch of road she once drove through a hard season, telling no one. Or a man who hums a half-remembered tune only when alone in the car, a tune from a version of his life he has never mentioned at a dinner table. And each of them is doing exactly what the boy Jung did, honoring a fact about the psyche that most of us were never taught, that not everything real inside you is meant for an audience. Some of it is meant only for the relationship between you and yourself, and that relationship does not fail simply because it never becomes a shared story. Think of it as a room with only one door, and that door opens inward, and the room grows no less furnished, no less true, simply because visitors are never invited in. Jung would say the opposite is closer to the truth. A psyche with no private rooms at all, a life lived entirely in shareable, explainable terms, is a thinner life, pressed flat for public consumption. Try explaining exactly what a certain memory smells like, or why a certain piece of music undoes you every time. You can gesture, reach for metaphor, but a residue always stays behind, and that residue is not a failure of the relationship. It is simply the fact of having an interior at all. And here is the part worth carrying longest. The boy in the attic did not grow out of this need as he aged into the old man the world remembers. He kept private rooms his entire life, certain stones, certain rituals, never fully explained even across the thousands of pages he wrote about himself, which tells you the private room is not a phase to outgrow on the way to some fully transparent adulthood. It is a permanent feature of any mind, with real depth. I keep a room in myself that was never built to be explained, and its privacy does not make it less true. The fourth key is an ordinary Tuesday, and I want to walk through it with you slowly, because this is not abstract. This is the actual texture of a day you have already lived more than once. You wake up carrying something, a mood you cannot quite name, a fragment of a dream still clinging to the edges of your morning, a low certainty that something in your life wants to change, even though nothing you could point to has changed yet. And already, before you have spoken a single word to another person, you are translating, deciding what part of that inner weather is small enough to be spoken aloud. By 9 in the morning you are at work, and a colleague asks how you are, and you say fine, not as a lie exactly, more as a kind of triage, because the honest answer would take 20 minutes and several false starts, and you are not even certain you could finish the sentence yourself, so you round yourself down to something that fits in a hallway greeting. By lunch, you are sitting with a friend, someone who genuinely likes you, and you try, just a little, to gesture at what has been sitting on your chest since you woke, and you watch their eyes do the polite and caring thing, nodding, waiting for you to arrive at the part they can respond to, and you feel your own words shrinking themselves in real time to fit the shape the moment can hold, not because your friend failed you, but because some feelings do not compress into lunch-hour language without losing exactly the part that mattered. By mid-afternoon, you catch yourself rehearsing, in your head, how you might explain the thing later, and you notice that even in that private rehearsal, the words keep coming out smaller than the feeling, like trying to pour a lake through a straw. And by evening, you are home, and someone who loves you asks what is wrong, and you say nothing. I am just tired, because the actual answer feels too large and too strange to hand across a dinner table. And here is the part I most want you to notice. At no point in that entire day did anyone fail you. Your colleague was not cruel. Your friend was not careless. The person across your table was not distant. What happened, quietly, again and again, all day long, was simply the thing Jung named, an inner situation that had outrun the available words, and by the time you turn off the light, you feel it as a low static hum of aloneness, a faint ringing behind the day, and it is tempting to read that hum as proof that you are somehow failing at connection, but I want you to read it differently, as a cost report, an honest accounting of how much of your inner life is currently running untranslated. Nothing more sinister than that. A ledger, not a verdict, and a ledger can be read calmly, without shame, the same way you would glance over any other account of a day, noticing where the balance sits without deciding it means you are broken. I read the day's silences as a ledger, not as proof that I am alone. If any of this is naming something you have carried quietly for years, stay close, because tomorrow's teaching builds on tonight's, and I would rather it reach you than miss you. The fifth key is the deepest one, and I want to unfold it in 4 parts, because it is the part that Jung himself lived out, not just taught. First, consider the letter he wrote in 1957, when he was in his 80s, to a man named Schmaltz, declining an invitation, and in that letter he wrote a line that has quietly become one of the most important things he ever said about the inner life. He wrote, "Solitude is for me a fount of healing, which makes my life worth living. Talking is for me often more difficult than being silent." Listen closely to what he was actually claiming there. Solitude was not, for Jung, an absence, a lack, a sad consolation prize handed to a man who could not get company. It was a source, a fount, something that filled him back up, the way rest fills a body worn down by a long day. And he said this near the very end of a life that had been, by any measure, extraordinarily full of people, patients who filled his consulting room for decades, students who crossed oceans to sit with him, an enormous web of correspondence that still fills volumes. So this was not the confession of a hermit. This was a man who had tasted every kind of company available to a human being and still turned, at the end, toward the quiet room, because he understood that solitude and society are not enemies fighting for the same territory. They are a rhythm, a tide going out and coming back in, and a life that only ever runs toward other people, never back toward itself, eventually runs dry, the way a well runs dry when nothing is ever given time to refill it. And notice too what he did not say. He did not say solitude was easy. He said talking was often more difficult than silence, which tells you this was a discipline he chose again and again, not a temperament he was simply born with. He had to keep closing that door on purpose. Second, consider the difference this reveals between loneliness and solitude, because we so often blur them together as if they were the same ache wearing 2 names, and they are not the same animal at all. Loneliness, as Jung described it, is the pain of being unable to communicate what matters most. It arrives uninvited. It happens to you. It is a door that's shut without asking your permission. Solitude is different. Solitude is a door you close yourself, on purpose, in order to hear something the noise of company has been drowning out. One is a wound you did not choose. The other is a practice you build. And the quiet tragedy of so many lives is how often solitude gets treated as if it were only loneliness wearing a disguise. So the quiet hour gets filled with a screen, a call, anything, rather than let it become what it might actually be, which is the very fount Jung named, the one place where the parts of you with no shared vocabulary finally get a hearing, not from a friend, not from a partner, but from you. And here is a further distinction worth holding. Loneliness tends to get louder the more you try to escape it, while solitude tends to get quieter the more you stay with it. That alone is often how you can tell which one you are actually facing in a given moment. Third, let me give you an ordinary evening rather than an abstract idea, because this is where the choice actually lives. Imagine a man who drives the same road home from work every evening, and every evening, the moment he turns the key in his own front door, he turns on the radio, or calls someone, or puts a show on before he has even taken off his coat, and if you asked him why, he would say he simply likes the noise. But if you watched him closely over a period of months, you would notice that the noise always goes on within seconds of the silence beginning, as if the silence itself were something to be outrun rather than entered. And one evening, almost by accident, his phone battery dies just as he walks in, and he does not have the energy to go find a charger, so the house simply stays quiet, and he sits down in that quiet without meaning to, and at first it is uncomfortable, restless, almost itchy, the kind of discomfort that makes a person reach for anything at all. But he has no easy thing to reach for, so he stays, and slowly, without any lightning bolt, without any dramatic breakthrough, something in him starts to surface. An old disappointment he never quite named, a wish he had buried under years of busyness, a shape of feeling that had been knocking quietly all week and finally found a room still enough to be heard in. That is the fount Jung meant, not a mystical rapture, just an ordinary room, finally given permission to hold what the day never had space for. And the strange thing is, the man walks out of that hour less lonely, not more, even though he spent it entirely by himself, because loneliness is the ache of the unsaid, and that hour, quietly, without an audience, let something get said. And here is the part worth sitting with even longer. Nothing about his outer life changed that evening. No phone call was made, no friend arrived, no problem was solved, and yet the ache that had followed him around for months had loosened its grip, simply because it had finally been given a room. Fourth, and this is the part I most want you to carry carefully, because there is a real danger folded into everything I have just described. Being misunderstood can curdle, almost without your noticing, into a private pride, a sense that your incomprehensibility is proof of your depth, that the people who do not follow you simply were never capable of it. And I want to warn you plainly against that turn, because it is not individuation wearing its true face. It is inflation borrowing individuation's clothes. Imagine someone who, after a season of real inner change, begins quietly enjoying the fact that old friends no longer quite understand him, begins, without fully admitting it to himself, treating their confusion as a kind of compliment, a sign that he has climbed somewhere they cannot follow. That is the exact moment the fount turns stagnant. Because solitude was never meant to become a private throne, it was meant to be a room you visit and then leave, carrying something back out into the world of other people, not a tower you retreat into so you never have to be questioned again. Jung himself was misunderstood by enormous numbers of people across his long life. Colleagues who broke from him, readers who flattened his ideas into slogans, an entire public that sometimes reduced decades of careful work into a handful of quotable lines. And he did not respond to any of that by retreating into a private sense of superiority. He kept writing letters late into his 80s, kept meeting the few who could meet him, kept building small bridges rather than declaring the room simply unworthy of him. The honest response to being misunderstood is not a quiet crown you place on your own head. It is a humble persistence, reaching for the rare conversation that can actually hold you, while accepting, without bitterness, that some part of your inner life may remain untranslated for a long while, perhaps for good, and that this untranslated part is not a medal, it is simply the ordinary shape of having gone deep enough that the common words ran out before you did. I return to solitude as a fount, not a fortress, and I do not mistake being unheard for being superior. The sixth key is the gentlest one, and it is this: being misunderstood is not the finish line, it is a stage, and stages, by their nature, do not last forever in the same form. Jung, even in his old age, even after that letter about solitude being a fount, kept a small circle of people who understood him well, kept close friendships, kept his door open to those few who could meet the actual man, rather than the mask or the legend. So the picture I want to leave you with is not one of a wise person standing alone on a mountain, permanently unreachable, admired from a distance. That is a fantasy, and a lonely one. The real picture is closer to a person who has made peace with the fact that most conversations will only ever reach the surface of them, while still reaching, again and again, toward the rare conversation that reaches further. And I want to slow down here, because this stage has a shape. It is not a single moment where you cross from misunderstood into understood. It is more like a candle placed in a window at night, small, steady, not blazing across the whole dark field, but enough to be seen by the one traveler who happens to be looking for exactly that light. Imagine a woman who spends years feeling that no one quite catches what she means. And then one evening, at a kitchen table with an old friend, She says some half-formed thing about what she has been carrying, and instead of the usual polite blank look, something in the friend's face changes. A small nod, a question that actually lands in the right place, and she realizes that the friend was not able to do this 5 years ago, and she was not able to say it 5 years ago either. Both of them had to travel toward that window in their own time. That is what the stage of being misunderstood is quietly preparing you for. Not permanent isolation, but a slow narrowing toward the handful of true meetings that were never possible before you did the inner work of becoming someone with something real to say. Think of it this way too. A seed does not stay in the dark soil forever because the dark soil is its final home. The dark is simply where the necessary invisible work happens before anything can reach toward light. And if you mistake the dark for the destination, you either despair too soon or you build a strange pride around staying buried. Neither is the truth. The truth is quieter than both. You are being asked to trust that the stage you are in is doing something, even when it does not yet show. You are being asked to keep the candle lit without demanding that every passerby stop and stare at it. Some will walk right past, most will, and that is simply the night doing what the night does. But every so often someone slows, someone turns their head. Someone was already looking for a small steady light rather than a blazing one, and that is enough. It was enough for Jung, who did not need the whole world to understand him, only the handful who could sit across from him and let something real pass between them. And it can be enough for you. Not as a consolation prize, but as the actual, honest shape of a life that has gone deep. I keep my candle lit at the window, and I trust the path without needing to see who is on it. Here is the whole picture. Misunderstanding is a signal, not a wound. The persona trades fluency for shared symbols, while the true self trades those symbols for depth. Some rooms in you were never built to be furnished for visitors. The small silences of an ordinary day are a cost report, not a verdict. Solitude is a fount that feeds you when it is chosen, rather than a loneliness that starves you when it is not. And being unreachable to most does not mean you should stop reaching toward the few. These were never 6 separate lessons. They were 6 turns of a single key. And that key is this: the gap between what you have become and what your old words can carry is not proof that something has broken. It is proof that something in you finally moved. So tonight, if you have felt that quiet, static hum of not being fully caught by the people around you, I want you to hold it differently than you have before. Not as evidence that you have failed to belong, but as evidence that you have begun to become someone your old language cannot yet hold. That is not the tragedy of your life. It may in fact be its most honest achievement. Say it with me one more time. I make the unconscious conscious. And again, I make the unconscious conscious. And as you go back out, into a world that will not always understand you, ask yourself gently, not with despair, but with something like curiosity. What if being misunderstood was never the wrong turn? What if it was simply the last honest mile on the road to finally becoming yourself?